Welcome to the SEGA Lounge, where we celebrate our love for all things SEGA, including the games, the music, and the community. I'm your host, KC. Join me as I talk to different guests and learn more about their projects and passion for SEGA. Hey there, loungers! Welcome to episode 224 of the SEGA Lounge. Let me start off by apologizing for the lack of regular content, which will unfortunately continue for the next couple of weeks. Work's been crazy, and there's also life in general throwing curveballs at me. I'm hoping things will get back on track by the second week of July, so bear with me for a little bit more. Until then, feel free to revisit or listen for the first time to some of our previous episodes of the season. We also recently celebrated our 10th anniversary, with a crazy fun edition of the SEGA Lounge Challenge, which you should watch, by the way, on our YouTube channel. Speaking of the anniversary, this seemed like a good time to pick up where I left off on episode 204. Remember that one? Back on episode 204, I decided to share some of my SEGA story, starting from the very beginning with Sonic 1 on the Mega Drive. That part of the story led us to the moment when SEGA announced they'd be leaving the console business. My SEGA story didn't end there, obviously, so as we celebrate 10 years of this SEGA-centric podcast, let me tell you a bit more about what my exposure to SEGA games and their universe was after that fateful announcement. Sit down, grab a drink and some snacks, and let's go back in time once again. If you were to ask me to define SEGA in a simple phrase, at least the SEGA that I grew up with, it would definitely be blue skies. Those beautiful graphics coupled with innovative ideas and great gameplay that transported you to amazing worlds were, for me, SEGA's trademark up until the end of the Dreamcast era. I think that moment marked the end of Blue Sky SEGA, which doesn't mean that only happened because they became a third-party developer. It would have probably happened anyway as a sign of the times. Realistic graphics became the trend, and as just another developer out there, the company needed to get with the program. That also meant that despite some initial projects that seemed to keep the SEGA spirit alive, other less inspired and less innovative ideas became sort of the norm. This little introduction serves as a bit of context to this next part of my SEGA story. I didn't know at the time that things would be bleak for SEGA for a while, and despite my initial shock with seeing SEGA games on Nintendo consoles, for example, I figured, hey, at least they're still around, so let's support them. And support them I did, starting with the Game Boy Advance, my first ever handheld console. As an aside, the fact that SEGA went third-party broadened my gaming horizons. I was a SEGA kid, and without that much money to spend, having all the other consoles wasn't an option at first. So I would have backed SEGA if a Dreamcast 2 had come out at the time, and a 3, and a 4, and so on, which would mean missing out on other great games that were exclusive to other platforms. By the way, side note, exclusives, while understandable from a console manufacturer point of view, suck from a consumer point of view unless you're a fanboy. Thank you very much. Anyway, having to buy these other consoles allowed me to experience other great franchises developed by SEGA's rivals. Now, back to the Game Boy Advance, I remember it was a big deal at the time. I ended up getting it, if not at launch, very close to it. I got the iconic Indigo variant of the original model with Rayman Advance, a version of a game that I remembered seeing running on the Saturn years before. My gaming time was spent between the GBA and the Dreamcast, which I was still playing constantly and buying new games for. But the year after that, 2002, the moment I had waited for arrived with the release of Sonic Advance, which is, for me, the best in the Advance series of Blue Blur titles. The infamous dimps brought Sonic to Nintendo's handheld in a game that was heavily inspired by the original Mega Drive games. A classic adventure with Sonic and friends that is still very enjoyable today. The sequel, Sonic Advance 2, is also a really enjoyable experience, although with a bit more dimps flavor to it for better or worse. And with Sonic Advance 3, they went all out and tried to emulate the Sonic Heroes formula by pairing two characters at all times and giving you special abilities dependent on the pair you selected. Yeah, that one is my least favorite of the three. One cool thing they all had was a Chow Garden, which was something like a more fleshed out version of the minigame you could play when you downloaded a Chow from the adventure games to your Dreamcast VMU. You could also use it as a way to customize and grow your Sonic Adventure DX and Sonic Adventure 2 Battle Chow on the GameCube, but I never used that functionality. But it wasn't all Sonic on the GBA. Let's talk Sega Smash Pack. That's another memorable experience for me, albeit not for the best of reasons. This game was a compilation of three classic Mega Drive titles: Echo the Dolphin, Golden Axe, and Sonic Spinball. To be completely honest, I don't remember much about the Golden Axe port, and I think Spinball was okay, and probably the first time I was ever able to sit down and make some progress through the game. I do remember Echo the Dolphin quite well. For one, it was an accurate port which controlled well and was decent enough to look at on that tiny screen. Still hard as nails, but that speaks to the quality of the port, I guess. What I remember the most about this version of Echo, however, is its soundtrack. If you can even call it that. Every single level used the same track. The same one. Over and over again. The time travel tune, probably a classic to most Echo fans, is however really short, and after hearing it looping over and over again after playing the game for a while, it becomes the stuff of nightmares. Wasn't there enough space in the cartridge to include the whole soundtrack? Was it technically challenging to pull off? Were there licensing issues? I have no idea, but it's a memory of mine. Last time, I also mentioned Jet Set Radio as a standout title in the Dreamcast library. What about the GBA version of Jet Set Radio? I don't recall exactly when I got this and how I discovered it, but I was probably looking through the GBA section in a games shop. I don't remember it being advertised anywhere, but it was Jet Set Radio, so I picked it up. Unlike its Dreamcast counterpart, this is not a 3D action game. Instead, you control your Rudy from an isometric perspective, much like in Sonic 3D. But due to the nature of the game, I would probably compare it to classic Micro Machines games. My take on it? It's not that great, although I played it to death back in the day. It was a new Jet Set Radio game I could take anywhere with me, so win, right?
Look at the fun.
Developer Vicarious Visions did an interesting job porting the original to a much weaker system and still somehow making it feel like JSR. The soundtrack was also much simpler and consisted of short samples of some of the songs from the Dreamcast game. Still better than that looping Echo song though, right? Yeah. Before moving away from the Game Boy Advance, a special mention to yet another Sonic game, Sonic Battle. I have a very specific memory of playing this game while on a longish train ride to visit a relative up north. It's a special little game that I probably wouldn't have picked up if it hadn't Sonic on the title. But I'm glad I did, and it made that trip much more enjoyable. I also played it on my way back. I wonder what a new version of Sonic Battle would look like today. Maybe even a Sonic Battle 2 with a new story, updated graphics, and refined mechanics. I'd like to see that. I guess this is turning into a handheld chapter of my Sega story, so I might as well own it. Let's talk about Sega on the PSP. It's easy for me to pick a short list of memorable games on Sony's handheld. Right off the bat, Virtua Tennis World Tour. One of my most played games on the system, and just an excuse to play more Virtua Tennis, a series I will once again say needs to return, Sega. World Tour wasn't anything revolutionary, but a great little version of this classic franchise in handheld format. There was a World Tour mode, of course, complete with mini-games to improve your skills, a tournament mode, and even a multiplayer mode which allowed you to connect up to 4 other PSPs wirelessly and play together, something I've never tried. The beauty of this was the core of every Virtua Tennis game, the gameplay. It was as intuitive as ever and a joy to control. Recommended. By the way, this was developed by Sumo Digital, a developer I'll mention again in a bit. Oh, and that reminds me of another Virtua Tennis game I played, the one on the GBA. Though not as graphically impressive as World Tour, developer THQ did a great job of bringing this fantastic franchise to Nintendo's system. The PSP also had Sonic Rivals, 2 of them in fact, which were probably the closest things to Sonic R sequels we ever got. That said, the races were much more linear than those in the Saturn Classic and in 2.5D perspective. There were also boss battles and a card collecting system, so they're probably more action platformers than racing games per se. They're both enjoyable, but I spent much more time with the first one, if I'm being honest. But the big one on Sony's handheld was, without a doubt, Outrun 2006 Coast to Coast. This was a more refined version of Sumo Digital's Outrun 2 home port that was also released on Xbox and PS2, although I guess this was in fact more of a home conversion of Outrun 2 SP with added content like Coast to Coast mode. Coast to Coast mode would be where I would spend most of my time with the game, being a sort of career mode with several different challenges to complete, bringing a lot of variety to the gameplay. The PS2 version even featured special connectivity with the PSP one, although I only ever owned the handheld game. This was a really special title that brought back memories of playing Outrun on the Mega Drive, a game I don't think I ever owned, but one that I borrowed from a friend from time to time. Again, the appeal of having an amazing looking game like this in a tiny device that I could take anywhere was really special. And looking back, it kinda explains why I'm so into handheld gaming and emulation these days. Since this is supposed to be a bite-sized episode, I won't dwell too much on a lot of other games, but since we're on the topic of handheld gaming, I wanted to briefly mention the Sega Game Gear. While I never owned one, I got to play a specific game on it a couple of times back in 1993 or 1994. There was this friend of a friend who I got to spend some time with back then, and he had Sega's portable system. He also happened to have one game with him during that time, Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Being a massive Sonic fan, I had to get in on the action and got him to let me play it for a bit. Needless to say, I couldn't make it past the first boss of the game. Years later, I still have a hard time beating the first zone whenever I try to play the Game Gear version of Sonic 2. Apart from that first hands-on experience, I've played several other Game Gear games throughout the years, be it via the many compilations of mostly Sonic games released on more modern systems, or through the magic of emulation. And I have to say, the current craze of handheld emulation devices is a great way to experience the pretty solid catalog of the Sega Game Gear. Let me just go through a few of the games that I've enjoyed in recent years. Ristar is one of my favorite Mega Drive games, so when I learned that a Game Gear version of the game existed, I just had to try it. Although scaled down to suit the 8-bit system specs, this is basically the Ristar you know and love, with most of the levels from the 16-bit version present and a totally different one adding even more variety. This is one that I revisit every so often, much like its Mega Drive counterpart. Another game is Gunstar Heroes. The Mega Drive version was a testament to the talent of Treasure as developers. The Japan-exclusive Game Gear version shows off the skill of M2, who were able to cram most of the original game into this cartridge for Sega's handheld system. It's kinda impressive what they were able to do here, and a nice way to showcase what the Game Gear could do when compared to the competition. And considering how the Game Gear is often disregarded as a lesser system, I feel like this is a good game to keep in mind. For Shinobi fans, the two Game Gear games are essential parts of the handheld's catalog. You start both games as Joe Musashi, who needs to rescue 4 other ninjas, each with their own unique skills. As you do so, you get the ability to switch between the different colored ninjas and use their special techniques to overcome enemies. I'd say it's close to the Revenge of Shinobi on the Mega Drive, which is my favorite Shinobi game. Finally, something different, a shmup called Heli Wars, which was recommended to me by our good friend Skill Jim. This is a sequel to Taito's arcade game Halley's Comet. Shoot 'em ups are hard, man, and this is no exception. But I had the chance to play this just last year while on vacation, and I really enjoyed my time with it. It's a vertical style shooter, and as expected, there are swarms of enemies to destroy and power-ups to collect to improve your attacks. Not being a massive fan of the shmup genre by any means, I don't think this game brought anything new to it, but it's a pretty fun title that I recently discovered. So this was a bit different when compared to the first part of my Sega story. I've been told by people I mentioned playing games on my Steam Deck a lot. Maybe that's true. I do tend to pick up the Steam Deck and other handheld systems more often these days. Time is limited, and I find myself even streaming games from my home consoles to the deck and playing in bed before sleeping. I'm old and tired, yeah. But that reminded me of how important handheld gaming was for me from the Game Boy Advance onwards. It allowed me to play more Sega stuff and to discover other franchises that I never would have tried otherwise. Handheld consoles have always had spin-offs of major series or slightly different versions of major games that are also worth a try. The Game Boy Advance still has a very special place in my heart, and I'm planning a future episode dedicated specifically to Sega games on that system. Maybe with a special guest or two. I'd love to know your thoughts on this, though. Were you ever a big handheld gamer? Do you still enjoy gaming on the go, even if it's just going from one room in the house to another? Do you have a special memory related to the Game Gear or Sega games on other portable systems? Let me know on X Twitter or our other social platforms. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. As I said, things will hopefully settle down soon, so stay tuned for more content on the Sega Lounge, including our reactions to Super Monkey Ball Banana Rumble. Thanks for supporting the show. I'll be back very, very soon. Bye-bye. The Sega Lounge, hosted by me, KC, and part of Radio Sega's network of live shows and podcasts. Theme song and incidental music by OSC. Got any suggestions? Drop me an email to podcast@thesegalounge.com. Find us at The Sega Lounge on X, Twitter, and Instagram, at thesegalounge.com on Blue Sky, and be sure to check out our Twitch and YouTube channel for live video content. You can find previous episodes of the show by going to thesegalounge.com, on the Terra Player app, and wherever you listen to podcasts. A Mixed On Productions podcast.